you for joining us. We are at the very end of the 9th chapter of Kohelet, the 9th chapter of Ecclesiastes, and we've been going through an interesting thing. To recap what we saw last week, King Solomon introduces a new topic, or a potentially related topic, but he says a very interesting thing, which is that this is a big deal for me. He says, this thing I'm about to tell you about is a big deal for me, which again is a strange thing for King Solomon to tell us. Why is this one specifically big? Why does it reign so, or why does it take up so much space in his own mind? Is something we could, I guess, postulate about. We can't really say a specific reason, but for King Solomon, this is a big deal. But instead of telling us just straight out what it is that bothers him, he gives it to us as a mashal, as a parable. And we had the parable of the city that was under attack by a very strong, fearsome ruler, and what King Solomon refers to as an ish miskein chacham, a poor wise man. Okay, comes and saves the city. And it's funny. I actually met up with Steve at one point during this week, Steve Meyrovitz, and he had a good point, which is that a miskein in Hebrew, a good way to explain it is, if you understand the Yiddish, is a nebuch. A nebuch. Miskein is a nebuch. You know, it's actually a very good way to put it. So I appreciate that, Steve. So that's just a good way to kind of conceptualize it. If you understand the word, you understand culturally what that means. So that's a good way to understand it. And so we saw this progression where the ish miskein chacham, the nebuch or poor wise man, went ahead and he saved the city. Never told us how he saved the city. Never really gave us any information about what, you know. It's not a study of the military prowess of the strong old man, poor wise man, or anything like that. It's just telling us that that's what he did. However he did it, his wisdom saved the day. He was able to, through his wisdom, to save this city. And King Solomon tells us in short order, the person is forgotten. All the goodness, all the good things that they've done is forgotten. But what we found also last week when we were going through it was that there was an interesting shift in the language, where when he's first introduced, when this hero is first introduced, he's referred to as Ish Miskein Chacham. He's given these two adjectives and a pronoun, so to speak. He's a person who is a poor and wise. And then eventually he's just referred to as Ish Miskein, the poor man. Doesn't refer to him anymore as wise. It says that his wisdom is actually disgraced. And then at the end, it stops calling him Ish. The third time it mentions him by name, so to speak. It only refers to him as the Miskein. It refers to him as the poor person. Not even the poor man, the poor person. So there's this process of dehumanization that occurs to this wise person. And we were kind of trying to grapple and trying to understand, well, what it was about this person that made him lose. Why did people lose their interest in him? And so what I offered last week was that the issue is the one piece that always sticks around. The reason why he doesn't stick around in history to the city is the fact that he's the miskein. He's just the poor, the nebuch, the no goodnik, the shlemiel, the shlemazel, if you will. Again, another couple Yiddish words that might help out. So there's nothing so special about him, except for the fact that he was wise and his wisdom saved the day. But that's not good enough to mark him in history. And that's the nature of wisdom, is that wisdom has to come from a source that people connect to. That people don't, if you don't have the looks, if you don't have the money, if you don't have, whatever it is, what we refer to as heuristic elements, heuristic factors, HEUR, heuristic, outside just kind of come off well factors, then you're not going to get very far. Even you could be the wisest person around and save the city. That's going to be that's going to, you're not going to be remembered for history. Just as I'm thinking right now, what's interesting is that in history, there's a big debate. I don't even know if it's a big debate even anymore, as to who invented or who came up with our electrical currents and the the light bulb and things like that. So in America, we understand this Thomas Edison, right? It's always, Thomas Edison was the guy who invented all that stuff, the great inventor. Although we're kind of finding out as time goes on that Edison himself actually didn't invent so many things himself. He had a team of people working for him. And it's unclear whether he perhaps had, whether or not he beat Tesla, Nikola Tesla, to a lot of those same inventions. And so it doesn't really matter. History remembers Thomas Edison is the guy who invented the light bulb. It could have been a worker in his labs, or it could have been at Tesla or anything like that. But he was lucky enough, because of where he was positioned in society and his abilities and his connections specifically, he was able to make a much bigger effect long term. You could just as if you'd like a little reading to do, you could look at the history of how Edison fought with Westinghouse about how to whether to go with the AC or the DC current systems, and the things that the perhaps kind of not great methods that he used to keep his system going. Anyway, so long story short, you could be put into this position where if you don't have all the pomp and circumstance, all the affair and everything, so then you could end up the wisdom itself gets lost with all those things. Okay, so that's what we're going to be continuing on in this week's verses. That all was a recap from last week. We are now going to jump into the screen share so we could check out where we are together, and we will see the verses. Sorry, verse Tet Zion, verse 16 was last week's last verse. Actually, I want to read it one more time before we move on to verse 17, because it kind of flows a little. You have to see it better to see it in the context. So he said, V'amarti ani, I say, this is again King Solomon saying, I say, Tova chachma migvura, that wisdom is better than strength. Okay. However, I'm putting in the word however, which I can't understand. I wouldn't be able to read the verse otherwise. However, the chachmat miskin bezuya, that the wisdom of this poor person, again, not poor man, not poor wise man, this poor person is disgraced, is considered as nothing. It's worthless. Udvarav einam nishmaim, and his words are not heard. Okay, so again, due to the fact, the way we're reading it is due to the fact that he is the miskin. That's his most identifying feature. Therefore, his wisdom is bizuya, it's disgraced, and his words are not heard. It's just interesting, just hit me as I'm reading this, that there's a distinction between his wisdom and his words. I don't know exactly if his words are words of wisdom. However, there's almost like a twofold thing. His wisdom is disgraced. And I'm assuming, therefore, his words were not even heard. Okay, that just a thought that occurred to me as I'm reading it. Okay, so that sets us up for verse number 17. Again, I'm not going to spend time on that. We did that last week. So verse number 17 says like this: Divrei chachamim, the words of the wise, b'nachat nishma'in, with calmness are heard in calmness. Mizakat moshel baksilim, instead of, or as opposed to, the screaming, the yelling of the ruler with the fools. Okay, strange verse, as many of them are. Let's read that one more time. Divrei chachamim b'nachat nishma'im, the words of the wise are heard in calm. Mizakat moshel baksilim, as opposed to the yelling of the ruler amongst the foolish. Okay, so we got two things over here. Number one is just right off the bat, we've got a contrast being made. We're making contrast between the words of the wise versus the words of, that's a good question. Are we talking about the words of the moshel, of this ruler, or are we talking about the words of the ksilim, of the fools? What's the contrast to? So let's take a look at this further. Just before we continue, the word nachat, we use it in modern, talking in conversation. Nachat usually refers to feelings of pleasure or pride But that's not actually what the word means. The word nach means to settle. So nachat would mean in a calmness and tranquility, in a settling. So the words of the wise are heard when they're settled, when they're calm. So I would say if we were to just end the verse right there, we'd be able to walk away with a pretty well prepackaged lesson. In fact, this is a very famous phrase. People say this to this very day. They say, Divrei chachamim b'nachatis nishma'im. The words of the wise are heard in calmness. They're not necessarily heard when you yell at people. In fact, that's the tack that the sages take on this, is that a person has to be very careful when rebuking other people, when correcting people in the ways that they're acting, if they're in such a position to do so in a very calm, collected, easygoing manner. Okay. Similarly, we have verses in, for example, is it in Psalms? Or I think it's either in Psalms or Proverbs. I have to remember now where it is. We say Deracha, Derachei Noam, that the ways of the Torah are calm or are sweet. We have that lesson that shows up a number of places. So the rule of thumb, so to speak, would be that if a person wants to educate another person in how to act better, it should definitely be done with a level of calm collectedness. Okay, benachat, in tranquility. Okay, again, nach means to settle, so in a settledness. So again, that itself, if we just take those 4 words, that's its own perfectly fine lesson. You can walk away and say, I learned something from class. All right. Divrei chachamim benachat nishma'im. The words of the wise are heard in calm. Okay. But however, that's not our tack that we typically take. We want to see everything in the context. And the context is he's clearly making a contrast. There's a contrast here between the words of the wise that are heard when things are calm and the yelling, the screaming of the Moshel Baksilim, the powerful ruler amongst the foolish. Okay, I think what we have to understand is, just to scroll up again over here and look at this last verse. He did say that Tova Chachma Migvura. Wisdom is better than strength. Okay. Now it's interesting that he notes that it's better than strength, right? It doesn't say that it's more powerful than strength. It doesn't say that it's more, that it's going to always win out over strength. He just says it's better than strength. Another way to read that perhaps was that the words of, another way to perhaps read that is that wisdom doesn't need strength. It's better than it. It's better than strength. You know, in the same way that you say you're better than that. You know, you don't need to resort to strength to get your point across. That's one way that I think we could possibly read it. And it's going to show up in the coming verse also. We have a similar thing. So in a certain way, I would say that it's not saying that wisdom versus strength is always going to win. In fact, I would say that it's actually saying the opposite, that there are ways that even though wisdom is something that is better than strength, it's more important, it's going to get you farther than strength. However, it doesn't necessarily always win in a head-to-head battle with strength. Okay, and so that's what we have over here in this verse. That seems to be pretty clear from this verse over here, is that the words of the wise are only heard when things are calm. So instead of reading it the way we read it originally, that the words of the wise are heard when they are calm. If you actually look at it, it actually says Divrei Chachamim binachat nishma'im. Not when they are calm, they are heard. Rather, they are only heard when things are calm, is another way that we could read it. The words of the wise are only heard when things are calm. It's explaining the last verse over here, that the wisdom of the Miskain, the wisdom of this poor man, this poor person again, is disgraced, and his words are not heard, is because it can only be heard when things are calm. Okay, that's the nature of wisdom. People are only open to wisdom when things are tranquil and simple and easygoing and in the right context and setup. That's when people are able to access wisdom. However, the opposite is true. There's another way of communication. There's a kind of a dark side of communication, and that's the way that people act when things are not calm. A za'aka is actually a very interesting term. Za'aka means to yell. So does tza'aka. Okay, the two words If you were to replace this Zion with the letter Tzadi, you would have another word that means to yell. So what would be the difference between the word Za'aka and the word Tza'aka? So I think if I were to just do a quick, if I were to think about it for a second, I would say that Tza'aka is a helpful yelling. It's a yelling out in prayer, for example. We find that Tza'aka usually means to call out in prayer. Za'aka does not necessarily. Za'aka means to yell at somebody in anger, or to yell at somebody in emotion, with emotion, against them, kind of in a antagonistic way. That's what I would think. Again, I'd have to probably go do a proper check and see if that matches up in other places in Tanakh. But I think that's the case. That Sa'aka would be perhaps, again, a working together type of yelling, and Za'aka with the Zion, as we have it over here, is an antagonistic yelling. Okay, it's a me versus you. And so what you have over here, and this also, again, this is why our system, the way we look at the verses is very important, because we have the word Moshel. Moshel is a ruler. You could always ask, what's the difference between a Moshel and a Melech? We had that earlier in the book at one point. And there are a number of Jewish commentaries. The one that comes to mind is the Vilna Gaon, who notes in a number of places that a Moshel is somebody who takes power by force, okay, and a dictator, as opposed to a Melech, who's a king, which can be dictatorial also. But generally, a Melech seems to have its understanding of, I'm working for you, I'm there for you. A Moshel is somebody who rules with an iron fist, a dictator. Okay, it's a very specific word. Nemshala or mashal, the shorish, the root word of there is it indicates force, ruling by force. So you have these very strong languages over here. You have Za'aka, which is this forceful, antagonistic yelling. You have the Moshel, which is this dictatorial force. Well, so that's how a Moshel is going to act. They're not engaging with wisdom. They're not engaging with a calm serenity. They're not finding power or control or looking to save the day through some sort of tranquil serenity. Quite on the contrary, they grab people's attention in a very different way with this antagonistic yelling. Okay, they yell at people. This is true this could be true by the wise too. We always say that I remember hearing before that if you're in an argument with somebody, whoever raises their voice loses first. You know, that's when the argument is now over. When people when their speech rises and they're now upset at each other and they start getting to a yelling match, there's no chance for moving forward at that point. People get stuck and they dig their heels into their position. They're not seeing anything more. So that's just the nature of communication, is that once that happens, once you get into Za'aka, so then it's no longer a constructive communication at that point. It's now a destructive or taking control communication. So again, we could just look at this verse over here and say there's this contrast where the words of the wise, if we wanted to go with that original lesson, the words of the wise are always calm. They're heard when they're calm. The other type of person, your dictatorial personality, is going to get into a yelling match. Unfortunately, you'll see that there's wise people who also get into yelling matches. It's a tactic used by speakers of all types to get people's attention. I've seen plenty of rabbis myself, people who I respect, but I'll notice that they'll get into a way of talking and they'll get yelling and screaming and we have to be better and they get into a certain mode where you're actually not listening to the words anymore. If you were to take a second and think about it, you're really listening to the volume. You're listening to the look of the situation. I was blown away just recently. I was on a flight from Baltimore to here, and I noticed that the guy in the seat in front of me had his TV on the chair in front of him. He was watching pro wrestling. I had never seen pro wrestling before in my life. I mean, I know about it, but I've never actually seen it before. So it's a well-known thing. Pro wrestling is all scripted. It's just kind of it's a silly TV show basically. It's not really a fight, as far as I understand. But before they get before they get the big guys out onto the mat to fight each other, they first have this guy come out and he gives this whole rambling long speech about how this is the fight of the century and you'll never, and this guy hates this guy, and I actually didn't hear the words he was saying. So it was actually a very interesting experience because the guy comes out and I'm watching him and all I see is his motions and his actions. I don't actually hear the words coming out of his mouth, but I know exactly what he's saying. It doesn't matter what the words are. I'm watching what he's doing and the way he's yelling and screaming and pointing and going like this and and grabbing the guy's neck and all. That's all it is. His entire speech, you could probably just get up there and say, recite the presidents. It's the way he's talking that's really that's grabbing the attention of the person watching it. So I just found that to be a very interesting, internal lesson for myself. And that's exactly what we're seeing over here is Zakat Moshel Daksilim. The way that rulers grab your attention is through Zakah, is through this antagonistic, in-your-face yelling. And again, you could find wise people who do the same thing, but they don't need to. The wisdom will usually speak for itself, okay? Wisdom doesn't need to come off from any big, again, this heuristic action or anything like that. And I just think about Stephen Hawking, who was, with his muscle dystrophy and I think that's what he had. Whatever it was, he was a genius of a person, and things he said were taken to be the word of God, so to speak, ironically. But he it had nothing to do with the fact that he was talking through a machine. Just that's what it was. What he was saying was very wise, was very smart, and that speaks for itself. It doesn't need the yelling. Give me 1 second here. I think it's interesting also, we're very lucky, I guess, is one way you could say it. We're able to, with the benefit of the distance of history, we're able to look at videos of Adolf Hitler, for example. You ever watch that guy speak? That guy can control a crowd. He had a very, very powerful speaking style. I don't speak a word of German, but you hear him talking and you see the passion of what he's talking about. It doesn't matter what he's saying, and you can understand why people got caught up. I mean, you can begin to understand. I'm not going to say you can understand. You can begin to understand at least how people got caught up in that terrible situation, and how many bad ideas or terrible atrocities have been committed in history because a powerful, charismatic ruler shows up and just does that and is able to overwhelm people's systems. I think that's another reason why over here he puts who is the group that the Moshel is engaging with? It's Zakat Moshel Baksilim, the yelling of the ruler by a Kasil. So we have a number of terms that he uses throughout Kohelet to refer to fools, right? People who are not endowed with wisdom. And the Kasil is something that we've talked about a number of times. The Kasil is somebody that literally means to be covered over with a layer, right? That's the idea of a Kasil, is they're stuffed up. They're unable to hear. So once that power, that force of the Zakat Moshel comes at them, it becomes impossible for them to hear anything else. Wisdom doesn't get through because there's something else blocking it. You have this, this energy from the Zakat Moshel, from this violent or dictatorial ruler who comes in the way. So we have, again, the contrast here being, on one side you've got the Divrei Chachamim. In order for those words to get through, you have to have nachat. You have to have some sort of tranquility. The other group, the guy, clamoring for power, he's just going to blast his way through. He's just going to make his way because he uses these scare tactics, I would say. He uses these other tactics to get his point across. And that's what blocks chachma, wisdom, from ever getting to people's ears. So no wonder it's this explanation for what happened. What happened to our poor man, our poor guy, our poor wise man, whatever we want to call him. What happened to him? His words are only going to stick around when there's a level of calm in the world, when there's a level of calm around. Chaos is, of course, a great breeding place for terrible things to happen. I mean, I don't want, we'll veer away from COVID because it's still a little too fresh. But when, the thing that any politician ever wants is a chaos, is a crisis to happen. They say never let a good crisis go to waste. That's the politician's motto, right? Get up and we need more money for this, or these guys have gotten up and these are the bad guys. We're going to blame these people. We're going to there's always someone to blame, and unfortunately, it's ksilim, it's the fools who catch the message, and they're blocked because those heuristic elements. They're blocked from hearing anything else. Okay, that takes us to verse number 18, the last verse in the chapter. And again, he uses the same formula. He says, Tova Chachma, wisdom is greater, again, I keep on saying greater, is better than Kli Karav, Miklei Karav, than weapons. Okay, Klei Karav are tools of war. All right, wisdom is better than tools of war. The Choteh Echad, and one sinner, Ya'abed Tova Harbe, can cause us to lose a lot of goodness, can destroy a lot of goodness. Okay, let's read that again. Tova Chachma Mikli Karav, the wisdom is better than weapons, than tools of war. The Choteh Echad Ya'abed Tova Harbe, and one sinner can destroy a lot of good. And again, if we haven't gotten the point yet, this is definitely a very important aspect of the point. The same way we said, Tova Chachma Migvura, right? Wisdom doesn't need strength. It's better than strength. Again, in the same way we would say, you're better than that, right? Wisdom doesn't need strength. Wisdom doesn't need tools of war, right? Wisdom itself, it transcends the need for tools of war, for weapons. It doesn't require that. The wisdom will, the point of wisdom will get across if you're in the right situation without any force. It doesn't need force to make itself heard and understood. However, the reality is that it bumps into other forces. When there's other more powerful forces, it can lose its power. It can lose people's attention, more importantly. Right? And this is an important idea. Choteh echad, one sinner can destroy a lot of good. There's an interesting thing. We don't really again, we've seen it over here that he definitely talks about good people and bad people, but he more focuses on smart people and not people not endowed with wisdom. The chacham and the ksil is the more common contrast that he makes. It's interesting that he brings up the choteh, the sinner. A sinner, somebody who sins, one sinner is able to destroy a lot of goodness. I think that itself is an interesting thing to note, that's what he's harping on. The sinner is able to destroy a lot of goodness. The sages, of course, are going to take this and they love this. This is definitely a message the sages want to say. They say, and this is actually an idea it's stated in the Talmud, but it's echoed in Maimonides also, a very famous idea that if a person should always look at the world as though the world is exactly at equilibrium between sins and mitzvot, people doing right things and wrong things. A person should see himself, or the person should see themselves as that they are exactly at equilibrium, that they've got good actions and bad actions, and they're right on the cusp. And if they do one good action, that will tip the scales over for them to be in the righteous camp. And then not only them, it's going to tip the scales for the whole world to be in the righteous camp, and then goodness will come to the world. All right, it's a kind of a very powerful, I guess, meaning it's a visualization that ascribes a lot of power to the individual, which is a big thing for Jews. We like individualism in general in Jewish theory. Okay, so that would say that each person should look at themselves and say, I don't want to be the choteh echad ya'abed tova harbe. I don't want to be the one sinner who destroys a lot of goodness. I want to be the guy who tips the scales in favor of goodness, and therefore when faced with a challenge, I'm going to choose the right, the good option. So again, this is a common theme in the teaching of the sages, that a person should make that choice. But I think there's another thing over here, this harping on the term choteh as a sinner. I think that's an interesting idea because we find elsewhere, I'd have to find out exactly where it is off the top of my head. But we have, if you go through Jewish sources, you'll find that, I mean, every good story, I'm not saying that the Torah and Tanakh is a story, but every good story requires a good guy and a bad guy, right? That's generally the case. Even if you think it's not true, even if you think that there's a possibility of total and absolute equality and that nobody is considered good or bad, I would challenge that it's not humanly attainable. So the Torah also has good people and bad people. Right? The good people, obviously, in the Jewish story are going to be the Jews, right? We tend to be on the good side of our own books, although we've got our own problems too. We're a very troubled hero as a people. So who's the bad guy in Judaism? And in Jewish culture, we have this idea that there's this evil force, this evil nation somewhere called Amalek, right? The evil Amalek, who are actually distant cousins of ours somehow, if you go all the way back. They're grandsons of Esau, the brother of Jacob. So they are our eternal enemy because of their first choice as a nation, which is that as soon as we left the land of Egypt, probably, just think about the calendar right now, probably just around this time of year, sometime between Passover and Shavuot, right? So could have been tonight. Who knows? I don't know. Somewhere right around now, as we left the land of Egypt, that we were attacked by Amalek. And so while the entire world was shivering, shaking in their boots because of the power that we, so to speak, showed to the most powerful country in the world, to Egypt, which really God did. So while the rest of the world was shaking in their boots, Amalek, in a foolish move, went ahead and attacked us. And the way that it's referred to in our sources is it's like an idiot, like a foolish person who jumps into a boiling pot of water. They're going to get burnt and scalded, but it cools off the water for everybody else. And now, next thing you know, the Moabites could also fight us, and the Midianim could also fight us, and the Canaanites were no longer quite as afraid of us. And ever since then, we've been, fighting off enemies on all sides. And it's just the nature of things. So what you have over there is also, they're referred to in a number of places, choteh, the sinner. And my teacher, Rabbi Kagan in Denver, who taught me many things, I remember him saying once that Amalek is referred to as a scoffer or a cynic elsewhere. It's this idea of cynicism, that you're able to take something that's very important and very something that should occupy a heavy place in a person's mind, and a cynic can come in and kind of just do away with all the importance that you ascribe to something, right? You can have something, whether again it's just culturally we consider something to be very important, and one person shows up and says, it's no big deal, or makes a joke about it, or makes light of it, and that reduces its reverence in the general culture. So what I would say over here is that King Solomon is identifying the number one most powerful force against wisdom. He keeps on mentioning that wisdom is better than this, it's better than that, it's got all these great qualities, and it should be able to be heard in many situations. However, there's one thing that's always going to destroy it. One sinner can destroy much good with the power of cynical irreverence, right? If you take something and you and you just make light of very important things, then the words of wisdom are never going to get through. Okay? If a person walks away, let's say they go to a speech or a class or something like that, and they walk away with this empowered feeling of like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be a better person, or I'm going to start studying more Torah, or I'm going to work on self-growth and something like that. Then somebody comes over and makes a joke, or, not to say that you can't have humor, but if somebody goes and does something that just kind of reduces, somebody comes over, you walked away, you had a great speaker, you walked away, you're on fire, you're empowered, and somebody says, that speaker, whatever, he could have been funnier, or he could have been, something like a little comment like that can ruin a lot of that good feeling that you walked away with. So choteh echad, one sinner, again, not to mark people as sinners, let's leave that for Amalek, right? They're the sinners. But the idea, the cynicism that they embody is something that can destroy a lot of goodness in the world, right? For at least recent history, people have stood up for the national anthem, right, in America. Right, at the beginning of sports games, they play the national anthem. People stand up, they put their hands on their hearts, they take off their hats, something like that. And now there's a movement among certain people to stop doing that. Now, there's a discussion there. We can have a discussion about whether you're right, maybe there are things that we should be bringing up, and but there's no question. Again, I'm not going to talk about the politics of that. Everyone can believe whatever they want to believe about that. I'm just pointing out that what it does is it's going to reduce the reverence that people have to that national focus point of patriotism. You could tie it back to Jimi Hendrix himself at Woodstock. I don't know, wherever you want to place the blame. At some point, the reverence that was once given to this thing was reduced. Again, maybe that was correct, maybe it wasn't. We could have that discussion outside of the class or anything like that. Anyway, the point is that that's just an illustration. You see that happened. You can see that it's occurred. So that cynical irreverence, again, it's kind of that double piece. It's cynicism plus irreverence, IRR. That cynical irreverence can ruin things that are actually very powerful. And I'm just going to start the next. I'm going to do the next verse. It's a short little verse, but as we say many times, the chapters are not given to us by they're not actually in the book. Christian monks came ahead and gave us the chapters. They often do not align if we were to what I would say would be proper breakups. So this verse, I believe, still belongs to the last idea. And he illustrates it with another parable. And he says, Zivuvei mavet, dying flies of death. Okay, those are almost all the country. As far as I could tell, all the commentaries say it's flies that are dying. Okay, Yavish yabia shemen rokeach. They spoil and spread disease through spiced oil. Okay, that's a difficult statement right there. Yakar mechachma mikavod, and what's more powerful, what's heavier, literally, than wisdom and honor is sichlut ma'at, little bit of foolishness, little silliness, is more powerful than wisdom and honor. Okay, I don't want to. We'll pick up again from this verse next week because I don't want to rush through it. But you get the idea at least. We'll review this next week. You get the idea that you can have something that's very, very fancy, very powerful. This shemen rokeach, this spiced oil, which is a luxury, but a fly that's dying could drop into it, and that fly can be carrying disease, and it can spread into it. And next thing you know, you've spoiled all the wine, and then there's disease running rampant all over the place, and a little bit of cynicism, a little bit of silliness at the wrong moment can ruin a lot of things. Again, that's not to say humor is not allowed. Humor is very Jewish, right? We know humor is a very Jewish trait. So there's nothing wrong with humor in and of itself, but cynicism that destroys the importance that we place on actually important things, that is a dangerous tool that we don't want to. We want to be very careful of. So that is the idea. Again, tying it all the way back. King Solomon says, this is the one that gets me the most. Right? This is the idea that gets to me the most, is because you can have somebody who writes a whole book on wisdom, right? That's what he did. He wrote a whole book on wisdom, but a little bit of cynicism, one word can ruin the whole book. It's a fascinating thing. So no wonder he says this one stands out to me specifically. All right, let's go back into our main session here. All right. Thank you all for joining us, and God willing, I believe we should still be on next week. It's not quite Shavuot yet, so we should be on next week. And yeah, God willing, I'll see you then. We'll continue with the 10th chapter of the book.